was mentally unstable. He personally delivered, one by one, all 5 of his infant children by his mistress to the foundlings' home down the street, and his ideas do encourage unprincipled behaviour. He believed that true virtue lay in the noble savage who is uncorrupted by civilization. He was against a social contract that guaranteed natural rights and in favour of dictate by the general will. This, he felt, was bound to be directed toward the common good, and when the individual voluntarily subjected himself to it, he would be forced to be free. Inevitably, this has an ominous ring to 20th century ears. Rousseau's ideas were to inspire both the glories and the excesses of the French Revolution, and continue to play a similar role in the 20th century. His ideas are recognizable in fascism and communism, as well as in the underlying drift toward self-expression and liberalism. But the Rousseau who met Hume was more than just a time bomb of explosive ideas. As a man, he is best understood as the genius who inspired the Romantic movement, and personally as a walking, naked sensibility. He was the precise opposite of Hume, both temperamentally and philosophically, and yet they were both on the same side. They both strove for reform. The old Europe of absolute monarchs and the landed gentry was beginning to give way to a more communal urban society with liberal democratic tendencies. A process of evolution had started with Descartes and progressed with the rise of the introspective novel. Europe was witnessing the advent of a widespread self-consciousness, the birth of an individuality that thought for itself. Rousseau's concern was with individuality itself, its expression and self-realization. Hume was concerned with the condition of thinking for oneself and seeing the world through eyes cleansed of the old preconceptions. There is no such thing as a soul. No one has ever perceived a mind. We experience no causality or God. Rousseau, on the other hand, produced no coherent philosophy, but will be remembered forever for resonant ideas such as the noble savage, and sayings such as, "Man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau was on the run after publishing Émile, which supported democracy and denied the divine right of kings, and Hume offered to look after him. Unfortunately, by the time Rousseau arrived in England, he had been driven insane by his persecutors. He would embrace Hume, saying how much he loved him, but within no time he would become convinced that Hume was in league with his enemies and plotting against him. Hume did his best. Rousseau did his worst. To everyone's relief, Rousseau eventually fled to France, where he began spreading all kinds of slanders against Hume. The philosopher had met the genius, and neither had understood the other. The nature of their meeting was ominously symbolic. The struggle between their two positions continues to this day.
This book is continued on Disc 2.
Hume in 90 Minutes, continued.
Disc 2.
In 1769, Hume returned to live in Edinburgh. By now he was enormous. The fattest of Epicurus's hogs, according to Gibbon, who was no lightweight himself. His comment on Hume was intended as approbation. Hume continued to work hard, revising and rewriting his history and his philosophical works, and writing essays. He also wrote an oddly objective and evasive autobiography. Perhaps he didn't wish to give ammunition to his enemies, who were many. To the conservative elements of the establishment, the church, orthodox academia, etc., he remained anathema. On the other hand, an anonymous pamphlet called Character of by himself, which was certainly about Hume and almost certainly by him, contains deep insights into his character and self-assessment. A very good man, the constant purpose of whose life is to do mischief. An enthusiast without religion, a philosopher who despairs to attain the truth. Exempt from vulgar prejudices, full of his own. Hume now became the famous old man of Edinburgh. He enjoyed dining at length with his friends, who became known as the iterati, but he also continued to discuss his ideas with his intellectual peers, such as his long-time friend Adam Smith, the social philosopher and pioneering theoretical economist. Hume and Smith shared many ideas on social philosophy, and it has been suggested that Hume even influenced Smith in his theory that the interests of society are best guided by the invisible hand of competition. This hand which shaped the 20th century, looks set to throttle the 21st, when there will be strictly limited resources for which to compete. But neither Hume nor Smith should be held responsible for the blindness of present-day economists. They lived at the dawning of an era of seemingly unlimited possibilities in so many spheres, an era on which the sun is now fast setting. But in other respects, Hume's ideas are often in deep accord with those of the 20th century. If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. And the whole world presents nothing but the idea of a blind nature, pouring forth from her lap, without discernment or parental care, her maimed and abortive children. Such opinions were a rarity in the mid-18th century. Gradually, Hume's physique and lifestyle began to take their toll. He became increasingly ill, and eventually 2 eminent surgeons were called in to examine him. One after the other they prodded their fingers and squeezed his massive stomach. In the end they agreed that he was suffering from a tumour of the liver. Ever the bold but sceptical seeker after truth, Hume prodded his own fingers into his stomach and personally confirmed their diagnosis, discovering a tumour about the bigness of an egg, which was flat and round. His health gradually failed, and he lost a lot of weight. Word got around that Hume was dying, and people flocked from far and wide to see if the great atheist would repent on his deathbed. Boswell arrived to find that Hume was lean, ghastly, and quite of an earthy appearance. It's difficult to decide whether this last observation is inexact or profound. But when Boswell asked Hume if he believed it was possible there was an afterlife, he answered it was possible a piece of coal put on the fire would not burn. At the end of a long illness, Hume died on August 25th, 1776, without repenting. A considerable crowd gathered outside his door to watch the funeral procession of the atheist. But he was not an unpopular figure with the mob, only the Church, and unlike the great philosophers to come, his philosophy remains plausible. But there's one snag. When we read Hume's philosophy, we recognize that we think like this, but we know that we don't live like this. Is it possible that this time philosophy was right, and that we are the ones who are wrong? Afterword. Epistemology, the investigation of the grounds for knowledge, was seen by many as the core of philosophy. Before Hume, epistemology had been a thriving industry, producing all kinds of theories. Upon these were based the amazing systems that were the pride and joy of philosophy. This was philosophy's main selling point, a system that explained everything. With Hume, the bottom fell out of the market. Hume showed that the construction of philosophical systems was no longer possible, but it is in the nature of philosophy to attempt the impossible. In the era immediately following Hume, German philosophers were to produce the grandest philosophical systems known to man. Kant read Hume and claimed that this experience awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers. As a result, Kant produced an all-embracing system of the highest ingenuity and insight. This in turn was followed by Hegel, who produced the greatest philosophical dinosaur of them all, a metaphysical system so vast and complex as to be well beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. It was Nietzsche who saw that these misguided attempts could only produce extinct beasts. In Nietzsche's view, there was more sense in a page of Hume than in the entire works of Hegel. Yet even Nietzsche failed to clear the epistemological hurdle that Hume had placed in the way of philosophic advance, admitting that Hume's objections to almost everything were unanswerable. The only way to proceed was to ignore them. We had to continue to philosophize regardless, just as we continued to live regardless of Hume's demolition of continuity. There were always lots of other things to philosophize about. In the 20th century, Wittgenstein adopted a comparable approach. Cavalierly ignoring Hume, to the point of not even bothering to read him, Wittgenstein soon arrived at a remarkably similar philosophic position. Great minds don't always think alike because they plagiarize the same sources. Hume may well have pushed Humpty Dumpty from the wall, but still nobody has worked out how to put him together again. Nowadays, philosophy insists upon ignoring certain questions which it deems unanswerable. It's worth noting that it also ignores certain answers. Hume, his true successors, and modern science. Hume's extreme brand of empiricism may have been destructive of philosophy and religion. He was mentally unstable. He personally delivered, one by one, all 5 of his infant children by his mistress to the foundlings' home down the street, and his ideas do encourage unprincipled behaviour. He believed that true virtue lay in the noble savage who is uncorrupted by civilization. He was against a social contract that guaranteed natural rights and in favour of dictate by the generalism and communism, as well as in the underlying drift toward self-expression and liberalism. But the Rousseau who met Hume was more than just a time bomb of explosive ideal will. This he felt was bound to be directed toward the common good, and when the individual voluntarily subjected himself to it, he would be forced to be free. Inevitably, this has an ominous ring to 20th century ears. Rousseau's ideas were to inspire both the glories and the excesses of the French Revolution, and continue to play a similar role in the 20th century. His ideas are recognizable in fashion,